The most common forms of workplace violence that nurses unfortunately are experiencing is verbal abuse. For whatever reasons, patients and their families feel it's okay to yell at a nurse if they get bad news, if they have to wait longer than they expect to wait. They believe it's the nurse's problem and oftentimes are very rude and yell and scream. So that's the most common. However, unfortunately, often this escalates. I've had nurses that have been spit at, punched, kicked, bruised. I have a nurse recently with a concussion. I have another with a black eye. So there's all kinds of unacceptable behaviors. And it's not just residents and patients, it's their families, it's the general public. It's a huge problem, and it seems to be getting worse. I think it's getting worse because we haven't been able to curb it. There hasn't been any consequences for these behaviors. So if you hit a police officer, it's a criminal charge. However, nothing happens when someone hits a nurse. There's always an excuse. The person has dementia, the person has a mental illness, the person's just waking up from anesthetic. There's always a reason. And I get that. There are reasons for it, but it doesn't make it acceptable. It's always the nurse's fault. They did something, they provoked them, they walked in the room the wrong way, they didn't bring their tray in properly, they didn't bring their pain medication when they should. All of those reasons are shaming the nurse. It shouldn't matter whether or not their pain medication is 15 minutes late. That shouldn't matter. That's not an excuse to yell, hit, slap. And far too often, we all look at that and say, I wonder what she did to make him hit her. That has to stop. We need to feel for each other. We need to make sure that we're safe, but we also need to support each other. And we need to see that nurses are getting the support they need. And it's okay if I have a little bit of trauma, PTSD, after I've experienced it. It's okay to say it. It's okay to get treated for it. It's okay to be debriefed. And it's not okay for the coworkers to comment on it, or why do I don't need that because I'm tough and she does. And I hear it over and over. We can't judge each other. We need to help each other survive. It was shocking to know that our nurses working in emergency departments all over this province had no personal alarms. So if they were in a room with a patient that decided that they were going to hurt them or hold them up against the wall or try to choke them, they had no way of notifying their coworkers that they were in danger. So personal alarms was one thing. Another thing that we had to work really hard on was identifying patients that have violent behaviors. The Nurses Union Manitoba started it, where their patients have an arm bracelet on to indicate that they have violent tendencies. Once we heard that it was happening in Manitoba, we started with government and the employers to talk about instituting that within Nova Scotia. And it's taken probably 18 months, and they finally agreed that they will put that in place. We need properly trained security, more than just one or two, in all our facilities, including long-term care. There is no security in any long-term care facility in this province. Unacceptable. I hate to say it, but we may have to get to a place that people have to go through a scanner to come into hospitals. Because right now, you can't get on an airplane without going through a scanner. You can't get into the legislature to see your elected officials without going through a scanner. You can't get into a courtroom without a scanner, but yet you can get into every hospital and long-term care facility in this province with any kind of weapons, guns, knives, you name it. Lots of our nurses don't have enough training on how to keep themselves safe, how to protect themselves. Non-violent crisis intervention, not provided in long-term care. Why not? So we need education. They need to know their rights. We also need the support of the employer and the College of Registered Nurses and the College of Licensed Practical Nurses. They need to take a lead on this as well. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act of this province and every other, Every single worker has the right to refuse unsafe work. That means no worker is expected to get up on a roof without fall restraint. Nobody's expected to go on a construction site without a hard hat. In fact, you can be charged if you don't have those. The employer can be charged or the worker. The same law applies to nurses. If a nurse feels that she's entering an unsafe situation because of violence or any other, she can refuse to care for the patient. And she reports it, and then it's her employer's problem to deal with it. The other thing that often nurses don't know is every Canadian, every citizen can use as much force as they need to protect themselves. Nurses often feel they can't touch a patient. They can't restrain a patient. They can't defend themselves. They absolutely can defend themselves. And they can use as much force as needed to get out of the situation and to get away from that resident or patient. And they need to do that. Domestic violence is a big problem, and tragically, we've had 2 cases that were nurses within the nurses union that were killed by their spouse. And you got to know that those nurses went to work and they were suffering from domestic violence, and somehow we as nurses miss it, and so we're so good at assessing patients and residents when things change. We're so good at it, but we're not so good at taking care of the people we work with, and that's no one's fault. We'll help as much as we can as a union. The employer will help, I'm sure. We're hoping to get domestic abuse legislation so that people don't lose pay if they have to take time away from work to get an apartment or go to court or do whatever it is. But no one should stay in a relationship that is not healthy. And nurses need, if they feel that their coworker is suffering, talk to them. They probably want to talk about it. You know, people are embarrassed. They don't want to talk about what's going on in their home life. But if you bring it up, they just might. And there's EAP. You know, we all have EAP where we can talk to psychiatrists and psychologists and people to help us. And certainly the nurses union will help any way we can. Anything we can do to help someone get out of an unhealthy situation, we certainly will. We will commit as an organization, and I will commit as the president, that we will not stop fighting for the rights of our nurses when it comes to violence in the workplace. Zero tolerance is our goal, and it's a reasonable goal. If a patient's family abuses a nurse, they shouldn't be permitted in the facility, period. Full stop, no questions asked. That's yet to happen. Oftentimes they get warned once or twice, and there's always some sympathy because his loved one is in the hospital. Doesn't matter. We have to have zero tolerance for family members. Absolutely no tolerance. We have no time for that. And we need an employer to enforce that. Unfortunately, we do have incidents of where nurse to nurse or coworker to coworker or physician to nurse, or none of it's acceptable. It doesn't matter if it's a fellow nurse. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a physician. You report it, and it's the employer's job to deal with it. And if they don't deal with it, you call the nurses union, and we'll make sure they deal with it. The Nova Scotia Nurses Union is probably the most active union on this issue, violence in the workplace. And partly because we are just tired of our nurses coming to us saying, what can you do about it? We're tired of hearing nurses wanting to quit because they've been abused at work. We need every single one of our nurses that are there. We need them to be working, and we need them to be safe. Most of the time, nursing is a wonderful profession, and nursing is so rewarding, and it's the best job ever. It does have some problems, and nurse unions and others are going to try and fix it. So, you know, I don't want people to get discouraged and say, you know, I don't want to be a nurse. But by reporting it, talking about it, seeking treatment if you need it, is what the new nurses need to do. And our senior nurses, they also need to say, that was Nurse Janet 20 years ago. Nurse Janet today is not taking it. I have a right to go to work and come home to my family safely. I have a right to do that. And I believe nurses 35 years ago felt it was part of the job. Heck, I thought it was part of the job. I've been hit, slapped. I never reported any of it. So hopefully our newer, younger nurses and the work that we're doing within the nurses union is making it okay for nurses to say it's not okay.